Okay, how's everyone doing? I'm Silverman. Thank you to the organizers for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here today to talk about ethics and professionalism in digital phenotyping. To conceptualize my remarks a bit, and I'll say I'm a clinician, an ethicist, and an IRB chair, and so when I think about these things, I think about them often from clinical perspectives and regulatory perspectives, and also research perspectives, and I think you'll see that kind of throughout here. The idea for today is we've heard all these very interesting ideas in this panel and prior to this in the conference about ways in which technology and social media and digital phenotyping can impact medical care. And my goal is to kind of raise some questions and issues and things that we should be thinking about, basically. In 15 minutes, we're not going to have time for an in-depth philosophical and ethical conversation of all of the complexities here, but my hope is to kind of raise some questions and generate conversation. I'll start by saying the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about what makes clinical research ethical, and that's for the most what we're talking about here is clinical research, is the question of scientific value and scientific validity. And I come to this by putting up a slide here with my own text messaging data from 2017. And you can see here, and Munmun actually kind of gave this away a bit for me, but here you have a baseline of around 1,000 with a peak in July and then slightly higher baseline afterwards. So the question is what happened in July? And so my wife and I had our daughter Emily in July. And so there were lots of pictures being shared and things of this nature. And so the context means everything here. I put this up to say this question of kind of what does our data say? It's clear, there's absolutely no question that our data says a lot about us, actually, and that with the right context and the right information, it's very clear that there is something there. And so the idea that, this is worthy of scientific study, this has true scientific value, and when the studies are designed properly, true scientific validity, to tell us something about ourselves, I think goes without question, actually. So the question is more, when you have that data, what is the impact potentially on healthcare? What is the impact on relationship with providers? How much data do you need? How do you analyze the data? How do you store the data? All of this. Those are the questions that I think remain more open and are the source of much of the research that we're hearing about today. And I think the question that comes to my mind is one of uncertainty. So yesterday morning during her panel, Shelley Greenfield raised the idea of uncertainty. And I think when I made this slide, I had the word uncertainty in my mind that, we actually don't know. We genuinely do not know the exact impact that our use of technology right now has on our brains, on our brain development, on our interpersonal interactions, on the future of humankind. There's true, genuine uncertainty. And the way that I think about this in the context of medical care is basically the less evidence we have, the more uncertainty we have, I think the more important ethics are, and the more important that we have to allow ethics and our basic sense of ethics and professionalism to guide our behavior. And so that's kind of my pretense for this talk, is I think that until we have the true randomized controlled trials to say this is exactly how you integrate this into your care and this is exactly what the outcomes might be, and then we do a basic consent process and we kind of don't have to think as much about it, I think there's lots of ethical things to think about. And when I think about ethics, so the question is, what are we talking about really? And I think Ipsit alluded to this earlier. The way I think about this is that we are thinking about collateral information, basically. So I think our digital phenotypes are a form of collateral information. And in psychiatry and psychotherapy, when we say collateral information, what we mean by that is information that we've gained outside of the direct conversation with the patient, outside of the in-person session. And I'm going to go out on a little bit of a limb and say, collateral information is good, basically. We could get into a debate on the ethics of collateral information, and we could talk about Freudian psychotherapy and allowing things into the room that aren't in the room, but I'm going to put that aside and say, for the most part, in modern medical care, we think about treating demented patients, delirious patients, suicidal assessments, malingering patients, etc. Collateral information is critical to our ability to formulate and care for patients. And so I think about digital phenotype as this is the same thing as when we used to talk on the phone to people and get data, send letters, have family meetings. Right now, people showing us pictures of text or showing us their phones with text messages, kind of giving us the information. Collecting their digital phenotype in a way is kind of the same thing. So the question is, what's the difference? If I'm saying collateral information is good and it helps psychiatry and digital phenotype is a type of collateral information, what's the difference and why is it that big of a deal? Well, I think personally my argument is that the difference is the way in which the information is handed off. So traditionally, collateral information is handed off in this kind of baton, hand-to-hand way. I could tell you exactly who I wanted you to talk to. We would get consent. We'd sign a release of information. You would talk to that person. I might not hear every detail unless I was in the room during that conversation, but I would know exactly who you were talking to. Or if I show you a text message, or I forward you an email, or I hand you a letter, I know kind of exactly what's in that, and I can make an autonomous kind of informed decision about giving this to you. The digital phenotype is much more complicated in that part of it is we are going looking on our own. There's not actually a handoff, and even if there is, it's hard to know exactly what's out there. You know, I was thinking about this and thinking about the idea, especially if we collect historical data on people, we don't actually know what we all put out there. I mean, and that's part of the kind of aha moment. I think this is what Shrith was talking about, that people say, I actually didn't know you could find out so much about me. And that's kind of the thing. When I actually got that text message data, I was doing my taxes and looking at old bills, and I was like, oh, look at that. My text messages went up. I had no idea, actually, that my own behavior was reflected in the data. So there's a certain degree to which, you know, and then forget about it if you start talking about Facebook posts or emails or things from a decade ago, right? So there's a certain degree to which, if I'm giving you permission to collect my digital phenotype, I actually don't necessarily know what I'm giving you permission to collect. And I think that is kind of ethically probably the most important distinction. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So the way I approach this is basically, so if we're talking about collateral information, you know, we get consent to obtain collateral information. The question is, so with everything I said, with the uncertainty of the impact of this on healthcare, with the uncertainty of the actual information, how do we obtain informed consent? And the reality is we obtain informed consent the same way we do for anything else. And so we talk about risks and benefits and alternatives and basically trying to kind of think about, so how do we have a good conversation about risk with subjects or patients? And so my summary of kind of, I think, what the risks to patients are of this is, so essentially the possibility of disclosing unintended or unwanted information. I do think that we all have secrets. I think that, you know, we all have shame, and we all have embarrassment. We all have some degree of things that I may not want you to know exactly what I was doing on the internet at 2 a.m. yesterday. And it may be okay for you to know in the grand scope, but I'm not sure I want to be sitting directly across from you and have to explain it. And so I do think there's a real caution about actually disclosing stuff that we didn't know was there or we didn't intend to disclose. There's the possibility of inaccurate information. So as Maman said, you know, the information itself could be inaccurate on the internet. The way in which we analyze it or interpret it could be inaccurate. There's a possibility we could get this wrong, essentially. The idea of becoming dependent or over-reliant on technology, I think this goes in a few different directions. One is basically, I'm trying to communicate something to you as my clinician, and I'm going to start using my social media or other digital ways of trying to kind of, you know, communicate this to you behind the scenes as opposed to the way I'm supposed to, and there's a possibility that, you know, you would miss it or there'd be a problem there. There's also the possibility that I get really used to this and then my next provider has no interest in doing this, and so I've kind of disrupted the way that I seek out care until we're all as a field willing to kind of embrace it together. Confidentiality and privacy concerns I'll talk a little bit more about toward the end of the talk, and then I think the potential to impact the therapeutic relationship or the treatment. There is a distinct possibility the treatment could get worse. There's a distinct possibility we could spend the entire time talking about your digital phenotype and not talking about the stuff that we're actually supposed to be talking about. People who do therapy here know that patients have a very good skill, whether conscious or unconscious, of not talking about the important stuff. And so this could actually potentially make that worse. And it's worth thinking about all those things and making sure the patients really understand all of those things. And I think one of the trickiest parts with informed consent, which was also alluded to earlier, and I think was alluded to a little bit yesterday in some of the conversation on digital divide, is informed consent is incredibly difficult. And so anyone that does research knows that actually getting subjects to understand what you're trying to do is very difficult. As an IRB, we expect a 7th or 8th grade level of writing in a consent form, and that's we expect the average subject to not be the people, sitting in this room doing this research who have advanced degrees and understand the nitty-gritty of this. And so the question of how do you take all of this uncertainty in these things and put it in a way that people can actually understand, and be very careful that we're not just having the people sign up who don't actually understand in terms of equitability and those issues. There are risks to clinicians. So the clinicians may receive unintended or unwanted information. I think about this in terms of sexual information. So if we collect everything that people are doing online, we're going to collect a lot of sexual information. There's no way around that, and I think clinicians are not necessarily ready to deal with that. I think that there's a certain degree to which, do you really want to see this? Do you really want to talk about this? Do you really want to think about where to store this? Very tricky. There's the risk of third-party information, and this is where you're going to learn a lot more about people who are not your patients, and are you ready to handle what you have to do with that information? Missing information is the same, that perhaps you've designed a system that is supposed to respond and supposed to alert you, and until you're 100% sure that works, you've got a lot of liability if you miss some information. Documentation complexities are kind of brain-numbing to me to think about. That so all of this information, it is true what Maman said, that when it is on social media, it's not health information, but as soon as I receive it as a clinician in the context of a one-on-one clinical relationship, that becomes protected health information. And so what am I going to do with that? Am I going to put that in their medical record? I can't actually not put it in their medical record. It's legal. I have to document this somehow, but how's that going to affect their health insurance, their life insurance, other things? A potentially for boundary violations. This one's quite philosophical, and I have mixed feelings about it, to be honest, but there's an idea here, I think, that we are not friends with our patients. We have a different relationship with our patients. There is a closeness that comes with social media that could potentially put us at a higher risk for boundary violations. It may not at all, but it is something to think about and study. All that being said, with my IRB hat on, I actually want to say that I think most of this research we are doing is technically classified as minimal risk research, and it has to do with, I think, what Ipsit said earlier, which is, so the federal definition of minimal risk research is that the risks are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life. And the reality is, right now, Google or Apple or someone's probably listening to my phone and collecting my data and knows where I am, and that is a risk that I've taken on in my ordinary daily life. And so much of what we're talking about is actually not substantially greater than that. So I say this to say I am the ethics guy who's going to talk about all the risks and how careful we have to be, but also to put it in context that there are many things we do in medical research that are far more risky than this. And so it is important to kind of have the full context here. I'll wrap up. The last big topic I'll talk about is confidentiality and privacy. And I come back to this to kind of with where I started, which is the medical professionalism part. So we have certain obligations as medical professionals, and one of those is the obligation of confidentiality and privacy of information that's given to us. And the philosophical reason for this is essentially, if you tell me something as a physician and don't have faith that I'm going to keep that private, there's a likelihood you will never come see me again, and that the entire enterprise of what we're doing in medicine falls apart if there's not some trust around kind of the sacredness of information. And so we have this obligation, and I think we're operating in a world right now where the sacredness of information and who owns information and how private it is actually very tricky. I go back to actually where I started this, which is to think about the difference of collateral information of old and collateral information of new. So collateral information of old, this is I'm going to hand you a letter, or even I'm going to send you an email, and you're going to open that. And there's no one else is, unless unless the post office is opening your mail for very extreme reasons, no one is going to see that. There's no one else kind of there. And once I receive that letter, it's up to me to then put it in my file in a locked cabinet the way I am supposed to, basically. In the new version, it's much more complicated. You're posting something, it's going on a computer somewhere that someone owns and someone sees. It's going to a cloud that someone owns and someone sees. All these other people are putting in data. It goes to another computer that someone owns and someone sees, and then it comes to me. And so it's much, much more complicated. And I think the questions that I think I always tell people is, again, it's not to say that we can't do it. It's that we have to be very thoughtful. So you have to be very thoughtful about exactly where the data travels, exactly who owns the data along every step of that way, exactly who can see the data along every step of that way. And we have an obligation as healthcare providers to make sure that every step of that is taken care of. So we have legal obligations around business agreements with people to make sure they're going to handle the information in the way it's supposed to be handled. And so I think it's just very important to kind of very carefully think that out as we do this. People will often say, well, what if I just de-identify the data? I'm going to get around all this because I'm just going to totally de-identify all of the data. And well, that's true, but I am very cautious about this in that what does de-identification really mean in the scope of a conference like this? I mean, in fact, in some ways, what we're saying is you almost can't de-identify some of this data, that at some level, it's going to be identified, and we should just call it that. And if it's not identifiable now, it will be 5 or 10 years from now. So I think we have to be very careful with this. When people come and say to me, well, I'm going to de-identify the data and it's going to be okay, I say, okay, well, we're really going to have to talk about what you mean by that, basically. And you're probably safer to just say that you're not de-identifying the data and handle it the way that you should be handling it. So I'll wrap up by basically kind of going back to where I started, which is the idea of professionalism. And so we as medical professionals have certain obligations to our patients. I think an obligation of confidentiality and privacy, an obligation to respect their autonomy and to obtain informed consent for everything that we do. And I think another couple that I'll add is this idea of perception. So I do think we as a medical profession have an obligation to think about perception. And it has to do with what I said earlier, which is that if people don't trust us, and it's kind of saying that the trust of the relationship is the most important part. If people don't trust us, we are no good to anyone as a medical profession, essentially. So I think it is incredibly important as we do this work to think about how we're talking to the world about what we're doing and actually talking to people. I think communicating and explaining how we're being careful about all of these different things I've raised is critical. And then the last one is we have an obligation of competence. So we have an obligation of clinical competence to our patients, which means we get trained in a certain way, we get board certified and licensed in certain ways, and these are ways of saying we are offering the care that is kind of we all want to offer and is expected. And I say this to say, and as this field evolves, I think it is actually quite possible that this will become part of our competence. I am bullish on technology. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. I think there is a place where in 5 years, in 10 years, it may be unethical not to search for your patient information online. It may be unethical not to review your digital footprint. And I think our competence in this area is critical, that we actually are obligated to see where this data can go and make sure that we're keeping up with it and that we do offer our patients the highest and most standard level of care. I think about this in a way that I can imagine a world in which you go in for psychotherapy and it's kind of like, oh, maybe I'm going to pick cognitive behavioral therapy, maybe I'm going to pick psychoanalysis, maybe I'm going to pick dialectical behavioral therapy, maybe I'm going to pick electronically augmented therapy, and this is part of my therapy, and this is what I want, and it's standard of care, and we can really help people with this. So I'll end with that, and I appreciate everyone's attention and happy to take questions anytime.